Okay, starting off, ESG has been like top of the shareholder proposal list for quite some time now. Do you see that continuing? Do you see that gaining ground, losing ground? Where do you share your thoughts on that? And to a point that Susan Dio made a second ago, is there a new trend on the horizon? Are you seeing things that you weren't expecting and things that we need to be thinking about?
You want me to start?
Perfect.
Well, I guess everybody knows, sort of ESG proposals. Last year, there was a big drop off in support for them. I think a lot driven by BlackRock and Vanguard, and maybe some of that driven by, when I say that, I mean this year, driven by maybe some of the impact of the anti-ESG movement. We sit in a lot of shareholder meetings, and I think in the past there's always been, we like your ESG strategy, we think you're a good board, the company's doing well, but we just have to support these types of proposals. And I think this year there was less of that, where companies, because of anti-ESG, and I think companies just doing a better job of disclosure, there was much more an ability for the institutions to support companies and against these things. I think going into this next proxy season, I think given that it's an election year, with pro-ESG and anti-ESG on both sides of the aisle, I do think there's going to be a lot of proposals that, despite the drop-off in support, I do think there's going to be a lot of proposals because of the political climate that we'll see. But I guess we just have to wait to see kind of what the level of support is. But I don't think the level of support is going to impact the number of proposals we see going into the next year.
I think the trend last year was more proposals but less support. And I think you may see that continue. The SEC proposed and adopted some rules a few years ago that made it easier for shareholders, made it more difficult for companies to exclude proposals from proxy statements. So I think the trend, and there's very de minimis requirements, as you know, for getting your shareholder proposal in the proxy materials. So I think it just takes a little bit of investment of time and money, and you can get your materials in the proxy. But I think that, to Paul's point, I think the support for those proposals is less than it was in recent past.
Yeah, so I'm sorry. No, go ahead.
Agree with all this, but I would take, if you step back a little further, first of all, ESG is just a stupid acronym. It means absolutely every kind of shareholder proposal. There's nothing left once you've done environmental, social, and governance. If you decompose it, some of them are still probably declassify the board, the kinds of things they were a dozen years ago. A lot of the new ones are report on, and then the report on is something that's not actually, I don't think I'm alone in believing they're not things that are going to help improve the quality of the business or the governance of the business, really. They're, in a way, setting up a next step where somebody's going to use that report to request or demand something else. Some of them are very clearly environmental, emissions, all that kind of stuff, but there's a whole broad range of these. This is the thing that I think about when I look at the trend in what we call ESG proposals. The ones people object to the most, we call ESG. Is that they're not really about corporate governance anymore. At least a lot of them are not. They are ways to make a name for yourself, either as an organization or an individual. The individual's been around for a while. We've had gadflies doing that, but it's taken on a whole new fervor here. The other thing is that they're a way to have a discussion that you can't have through other channels. Some of them are really trying to achieve through the corporate ballot and the publicity process attendant to it, things that are really legislative aims. I'm not really talking about energy here, but that can come through as well. There are a bunch of other things. I don't see this dying out through the SEC. It's kind of not the SEC's role to do that. Even if they wanted to, I don't know how they could do it without being sued into a standstill. And it's also not really, candidly, the responsibility of boards, even though it all comes back to you. I think it's fundamentally the challenge that the investors have to face, and that's what, to Clint's point, that's what you're starting to see more of now, is that I think the number of shareholder proposals went up year over year, as it's been doing for a number of years, but the support for them, the average support fell from something like 30% to something like 20%. I was talking with the head of stewardship, really, at T. Rowe Price's, Donna Anderson, who's been around for a while. She was a portfolio manager before she stepped into this. She's got a really calm sensibility about, is this going to help the quality of our investments. That's fundamentally how she looks at them. And she was telling me earlier this year that they and BlackRock have voted against more shareholder proposals this year than they have in any year in the past, and they're going to be pilloried, and she's right, they will be pilloried, by a bunch of other shareholder organizations who believe if it says shareholder before proposal, then shareholders should support it. That kind of infighting is going to continue. I think ultimately what's going to bear out is a balkanization of the shareholder base on a lot of these issues. Not all of them. There's some that they really truly do all care about, but those are going to be issues where there's actually some connection to the bottom line. Other things that are performative, I think we're going to continue to see a lot of those proposals, but you're not going to see a lot of support from institutions that hold an awful lot of shares. I think that's really the trend.
I think, please go ahead.
I was just going to add, to put a finer point on it, the SEC wants out of this business. It is not interested in a dispute between you and your shareholders anymore about what goes in your proxy statement. The clear intent of their new rules and pronouncements, the march of that stream of regulation has been, look, we're not going to read these things. We're not going to referee what goes in the proxy statement. If they meet the minimum requirements, chances are that's getting in your proxy statement. So be prepared to engage with shareholders.
Yeah. I think the other thing boards have to think about is, in the political climate, what your opposition statement is to some of these ESG proposals, either pro or anti-ESG, because shareholders, particularly in an election year, are going to be looking for the political angle to your statement and not just about the proposal itself. So, I think the number of proposals that get lobbied, the fact that it's tougher to get them excluded through the SEC process, and just the fact that they've gotten less and less support, companies fighting them less and less, I do think, as we said before, there's going to be a lot of them next year.
Following up on what you just said about the election year, do you see differences in an election year, significant differences in an election year versus non?
I don't know historically, but I think just how polarized we are now, and the emergence of the anti-ESG, I think it is going to be a different year.
You do see it historically in terms of there's always been proposals to report on your political contributions or your strategy.
Yes.
You see that swell in these years, but in addition to that, and this may be what you're talking about, election years are a lot more media pay attention to this topic in election year than else. So it's a good, if there's a lot of spotlight on it, it's a good year to make your name or get more visibility for your organization, whatever your organization happens to do. This was not an election year, but earlier this spring, so the 2023 annual meeting at Amex, they had a proposal that the SEC did not disallow to report on how their business was going to be affected by, or in states where abortion had now been outlawed. I'm not sure what that has to do with Amex's core business. I understand it's probably an interesting kind of idea. I don't have any problem with the idea, but as a proposal, it was clearly just a way to draw attention to whatever group it was that sponsored it. It didn't get any support, but that really wasn't the point at all. I think you're going to see more of this in election year. The other thing is you look at the proponents of it. So I started 15 years ago in the business, and the proponents were like Evelyn Y. Davis, and there were a lot of gadflies. Some of those are still around, but I think you're going to see a lot more proposals in election year from labor unions, for example. Perfectly legitimate to have labor unions, but one of the things they do is put pressure on management teams in advance of a negotiation. These kinds of proposals, I think, are probably a good way to do it. So might be nominating somebody to the board so that there's a employee representative on the board, which you have in Europe, but you don't have here. I think we're going to see a lot more of that kind of stuff. I think really it's more a matter of a lot of people on the shareholder side trying to figure out how they can use this either leverage or new weapon to their advantage. And again, I really don't think the point is to change how the company's strategy or how the company does business or how profitable it is. I think that the point is something else that may have very little or nothing to do with the company itself. On that upbeat note.